I think we have to realize that the same God who created Adam and Eve, spoke to Moses out of the burning bush, laid out the parameters of the sacrificial system, sent the prophets to correct issues in Israel, also sent his son to be the perfect sacrifice for sin, so that relationship with him and poured out so that we could have relationship with him and poured out the Holy Spirit on the church. God did not change between the Old and New Testaments. God is not bipolar. You know, we think of God as the Old Testament, big beard, big throne, big guy, big lightning bolt, zotting anybody who steps out of line. And then we look at the New Testament and we think of gentle Jesus, meek and mild. You know, he carried lambs a lot, had this gold thing that floated over his head and followed him whithersoever he went. We've got to realize that there is no difference between the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament. The grace and love that Jesus represented so clearly in the Gospels is also shown in the way God reached out to Adam and Eve. This blew me away. I have to be honest with you. When I read in Genesis 3, you read about the fall of man and you think, well, God says, you're out of here. They're closing down the garden. The gates are there. Got an angel there. Big guy, big flaming sword. Don't ever come back. But then we miss what happens next. It says that God created clothes for them. So if God was just the judgmental, condemning God, now he does discern, and he is the perfect judge, and he is just. But that same God went out of his way to clothe Adam and Eve, to say, you know what, I've not forgotten you. I'm going to prepare a way for you to still have relationship with me. You're going to be part of that process. That overwhelmed me when I recognized that afresh several years ago. And if you look at all throughout the Old Testament, from Exodus 34 on, when God reveals himself to Moses, he says, I'm the gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and rich in love. That's a whole nother teaching, but that's the God of the Old Testament. He reached out to Adam and Eve to clothe them for protection after they've been banished. And he wanted consistently throughout history in the story to find ways so that man could have relationship with him. So that call for acceptable worship, the need to worship God acceptably, was lined out in the covenant relationship with Israel. That has its correspondent in the call to worship God acceptably with reverence and awe in Hebrews 12. God who commanded to Pharaoh to let my people go. Why did he say let my people go? So that they might worship me in Exodus 9:1. Also shows the picture of all nations, tribes, and tongues bowing before the Lamb on the throne in Revelation 7. There's no distinction. We need the Old Testament and the New Testament. We really need to look at the big story as we look at how worship is dealt with in the Bible. Professor Andrew Hill affirms that the study of the New Testament alone leads to an inadequate picture of God's self-disclosure and his purpose for creation. I love this. We too must look to the example of Old Testament worship as an essential part of our Christian heritage as we offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. Jesus himself said, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them, in Matthew 5. So when we're dealing with people internationally, when we're dealing with other cultures, we need to say, guess what? It's one book, two testaments, one triune God. Let's look at the whole picture. And if we give them just one section, it's a truncated view. And we tend to paint God as bipolar. And people's image of God, as Tozer said, is the most important thing about them. So